Imagine this in the heart of the most resplendent palace of the East, behind layers of silk curtains and the lingering echoes of elegant court music. A woman appears, draped in the imperial robe. But she is not here to stand behind the throne. She is here to step right over it. Wu Zetian, the name that history books have described with every label imaginable, from a demon disguised as a woman to a living Buddha walking among mortals. But the truth, it is nothing like what those books have told you. She was once a concubine, then a Buddhist nun, then the mother of an emperor, and finally she became the emperor of the very people who called her a monster. Before we dive headfirst into this journey, bending the arc of history and peeling back the layers of painted morality, if you too are drawn to hidden secrets and untold truths, then hit that subscribe button now. Do not let the YouTube algorithm decide whether or not you are worthy of hearing what comes next. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Because as strange as it may seem, from all corners of the world, we are coming together to resurrect a story that has been buried for thousands of years. This is not just a palace drama. This is a question: if a woman were given absolute power, what would she do with it? And Wu Zetian, she answered that question with blood and with fire. A history darker than any Netflix series. If you think Chinese history is all about old men with long beards writing calligraphy under ancient trees, then welcome to the banned version of House of the Dragon, a place where the imperial harem is a battlefield. Whispers are daggers, and women must learn to kill with their eyes before they ever learn to wield a fan. Our main character today, a 14-year-old girl, the daughter of a low-ranking official who entered the imperial palace with only one weapon, a mind colder than ice, and an ambition taller than the imperial flagpole. Her name was Wu Meiniang, but you will come to know her by the name that made the history books tremble: Wu Zetian, the first and only female emperor of China. And if you are already thinking about Googling who is Wu Zetian, let me save you the search. She was the one who played the game of power with 100 million citizens, won every round, and rewrote the rules while dressed in brocade riding dragons and hiding her rivals' corpses behind her bedroom door. The problem is, this history hates her. Not just dislike history, resents her, condemns her, vilifies her, and writes about her as if she were a child-eating witch in a wig. Because she did what 1,000 years of men could only dream of, she declared herself emperor. Not empress, not regent, not mother of the emperor, but the emperor. The one who sat atop the mountain of patriarchy and set it on fire. But hold on. Do not let words like feminism or icon distract you. Wu Zetian's story is not a gentle ode to kind-hearted womanhood. This is a symphony of blood fire and ruthless political maneuvering. It is the story of a woman who did not ask for permission to change the system. She tore it apart, fried the pieces, and etched her name on the cover of the textbook. To understand why she was feared and why we remain haunted by her, let us rewind to the beginning. At the age of 14, Wu Meiniang was selected to enter the court of Emperor Taizong of the Tang Dynasty. Her title, Talented Lady, which meant she was just one among hundreds of low-ranking concubines, allowed only to sit far away in the palace and wait perhaps to be forgotten altogether. And guess what? When the emperor died, palace law dictated that any concubine who had not borne a child must shave her head and live out her days as a Buddhist nun, a life that had not even begun, a palace girl, without a name, without a love, forced into a nunnery, as if her entire existence were a programming bug written by someone else. But Wu Meiniang refused to accept that bug. And here comes the first twist that will make your jaw drop. After Emperor Taizong died, his son, Emperor Gaozong, decided to summon her back to the palace. Yes, you heard that right. Her new lover was none other than the son of her former husband. If HBO ever filmed that scene, it would come with a bright red warning contains politically charged incest. Needless to say, the Tang Dynasty's imperial court exploded like Twitter after a celebrity cheating scandal. Hundreds of concubines, empresses, ministers, palace maids, eunuchs, everyone knew that Wu Menyang had not returned for love. She had returned to fight. And she fought in a way that only those with no way back ever dare to silently watchfully, and with a bite that struck when least expected. From that moment forward, Chinese history was no longer a man's story. She was not merely a favored concubine. She was a virus slowly infecting the feudal operating system. One day, she would override the entire imperial structure and install her own order. But that is for later chapters. For now, we pause here at the moment a young girl forced to shave her head returned to the palace not as a lover, but as the first wolf to ever walk in embroidered shoes. A 14-year-old palace girl and her startup for survival among wolves. The inner court was nothing like what the period dramas advertise. It was not a heavenly garden with petals gently falling concubines playing the zither and the empress pouring tea with elegance. No. The inner court was a brutal survival ecosystem where even a glance could be interpreted as conspiracy and a single whisper could make you vanish from history as if you never existed. It was LinkedIn mixed with the Hunger Games, but without a report button, only executioners and poison. And into that world, at the age of 14, Wu Menyang was summoned to the palace. Not as empress, not as a prominent concubine. She started with the title Talented Lady, a rank that sounded fancy but in reality was nothing more than an ellipsis on the imperial hierarchy chart. Lower than the ranked consorts, not even in the official casting round, and a position that could easily be replaced by a potted plant if the emperor forgot your name. Her mother cried, according to the historical records. But Wu Menyang did not. She turned to comfort her mother not with tears, but with logic. Entering the palace is a blessing. Meeting the Son of Heaven is a chance to change our fate. Not the words of a dreamy girl. These were the words of a 14-year-old who understood statistical probability and knew full well if you want to survive, you must rise to the very top. Now imagine this. You are a teenage girl locked inside a fortress of 1,000 rooms, surrounded by hundreds of other girls, just as young, just as beautiful, just as ambitious, and fully prepared to stab you with a hairpin if necessary. No mother, no friends, only gossip, hidden eyes, and venomous snakes. You are not a Disney princess. You are a lone organism inside a zoo that breeds power. For 11 years, serving Emperor Taizong Wu Menyang was not favored. Historical records acknowledge her only as a minor concubine, childless, living in silence like a shadow. But it was within that darkness that the monster was born. When no one watches you, you can learn. When no one believes you can strike back, you can prepare. And when the world grows used to underestimating you, you become the threat they never see coming. Then the emperor died. According to tradition, any concubine who did not bear the emperor a child would have to shave her head and live out her days as a nun locked away in a temple. No tears, no names remembered. That was how the system disposed of human resources. Wu Menyang was sent to Ganya Temple, a place where the emperor's former women were buried under ritual and forgotten. But it was here that her resurrection began. No one could have predicted that the heir to the throne, Crown Prince Li Zhi, was once the young man who used to glance at Aunt Menyang whenever he passed by the inner court. And when he ascended the throne as Emperor Gaozong, he remembered. He remembered it vividly. According to historical records, Gaozong paid a visit to Ganya Temple, saw Menyang again, and something ignited within him. It may have been love, it may have been desire, but it was certainly an attraction capable of destabilizing an entire system. He brought her back to the palace not as a former concubine, but as a newcomer, breaking every rule, leaping over imperial bans, and sending shockwaves through the court. Let us pause here. We are talking about a woman who had already been discarded, now returning to the stage in a leading role. Once labeled a nun, now suddenly becoming the most powerful woman in the imperial harem. The concubines were furious. The ministers protested. The empress erupted. But Gaozong did not care, and Fu Meinyang, she began to smile. No one understood the palace better than someone who had once lived in it as an invisible shadow. No one grasped how the court truly functioned better than someone who had once been crushed by its weight. And now, as the sole recipient of the emperor's favor, Wu Meinyang played her first-hand silence. No arguing, no power plays, just giving birth. She threw the palace into chaos with a calmness colder than ice. She gave birth to her first son, Li Hong, who would later be named Crown Prince. And just like that, the woman who was once cast out for being childless now carried a future emperor in her womb. It was a move that sent her rivals into panic, because they understood this was no longer a game of favored concubine. This was the prelude to a new dynasty. If you listened closely to the atmosphere of the palace at that time, you would have heard the scent of something burning. Not incense, but the sound of rules being set on fire one page at a time. The high officials began submitting formal protests. She was accused of immorality, of being a seductress, of violating filial piety for having once been her new husband's father's concubine. But Gaozong said nothing. And the more she was hated, the more silent Wu Meinyang became, and the higher she rose. And this was only the beginning. The real game would begin in the next chapter, when she started eliminating rivals, dethroning the empress, and setting the stage for the greatest twist in imperial history, not to become a consort, not to become an empress, but to become emperor. The story of Wu Zetian has no villain, because she was the villain in the eyes of historians and the protagonist in the eyes of her time. Only one question remains when you have been a nameless palace girl, cast into a temple, denied by the entire system. What do you have left to lose? The answer is nothing. And that is what makes you the most dangerous of all. From the former wife of a king to a reborn concubine. In most fairy tales, when a woman is sent to a temple, the story ends there. Once the monastery doors close, so does her life: no love, no power, no name. But Wu Meinyang did not live in a fairy tale. She lived in official history, a world where laws were written by men to protect men, and women had only two options: stay silent or flip the table. When Wu was exiled to the temple, she did not cry. She did not plead. She shaved her head, put on a nun's robe, and began to observe. Because she understood power does not die. It only enters hibernation. And all she needed was one small opportunity to wake it back up. And that opportunity came from the most unexpected place, the son of her former husband. Li Zhi, later known as Emperor Gaozong of Tang, had once been a bright-eyed prince who used to secretly glance at Wu Meinyang from afar, back when she was just a low-ranking, talented lady under the reign of his father, Emperor Taizong. The boy had never forgotten the gaze of that woman, even as time let her hair grow long in the temple and her back bend slightly from years of meditation. When Li Zhi became emperor, he broke tradition and summoned her back from political death. Yes, a system update that everyone opposed, but was forced to download. This move did more than shock the court. It cracked the foundation of a moral code that had been locked in place for centuries. An emperor taking back his father's former concubine, a Buddhist nun returning to the harem. The ancestors on the altar probably stirred in their shrines. The ministers united in protest, submitting formal complaints and branding her a disaster upon the realm. But Gaozong brushed them all aside. He had no interest in advice when his heart had already drafted a new plan. And Wu Menyangxi said nothing. She did just one thing: she became pregnant. When Li Hong was born, their first son, everything changed. Suddenly, she was no longer a nun recalled by a lustful king. She was the mother of the future crown prince. And with just that title, she began transforming the entire harem into a blood-stained chessboard. The empress at the time, Lady Wang, like many empresses before her, believed that holding her position and displaying virtue would earn her respect. She was wrong. Lady Wang did not understand that the harem was not a morality play. It was a black market of power where virtue was locked away in a silk box, and those who refused to fight were simply devoured. Empress Wang and consort Xiao, the two women who had once basked in Emperor Gaozong's affection, suddenly found themselves having to share the spotlight with a woman who had once worn the humble brown robes of a nun. They joined forces against Mainyang. They spread rumors, set traps, manipulated palace maids, and waited for her to fall on her own. What they did not expect was that Mainyang did not play by the old rules. She rewrote the game. According to one highly controversial entry in the official histories, Mainyang once strangled her own infant daughter, the baby girl she had with Emperor Gaozong, and then blamed the murder on Empress Wang. The scene unfolded like a Shakespearean tragedy, the tiny body bluish, and still blood trickling from her nose. A palace maid pretending to be horrified, and then Mainyang storming in like the lead actress in a courtroom drama, wailing and screaming, "It was the empress. She did this." And in a world where men held power but listened only to what they could see with their own eyes, Mainyang did not need evidence. She only needed emotion. Gaozong was convinced not by logic but by tears, and by a dead child. Empress Wang was placed under house arrest. Later, she was deposed, and consort Xiaoshe did not fare any better. Some records claim that Mainyang had their hands cut off, their eyes gouged out, and their heads displayed on spikes, though it is likely these gruesome details were upgraded by bitter male historians. But one truth remains: within just 3 years, she had eliminated every single rival in the imperial harem. And so from the title of reborn concubine, she climbed straight to the throne of empress. No one dared look her in the eye by then, because behind her was blood, and before her stood a court, too frightened to guess what this woman might do next. But if they had known, they might have run far earlier, because Wu Menyang had no interest in ruling the harem. She did not need the harem. She wanted the throne, and in the next chapter she would begin to turn against her own son. But wait. That is a story for later. The part where you will have to ask yourself, is it truly possible to love your child and destroy them in the same breath if the throne is at stake? Overturning the harem, deposing the empress, and rebuilding the throne. Once you have killed for the throne, you do not get to go back to being a good person. There is no formal apology to submit. No quiet days of prayer that can erase the moment you strangled your own child. Wu Menyang knew this better than anyone. So instead of regretting, she climbed higher. After casting aside Empress Wang and disposing of consort, Xiao Menyang had no reason to hide anymore. The power game was no longer just a palace civil war. Now it was the politics of the entire imperial court, and Wu Menyang was its chief architect. She was no longer the woman beside the emperor. She stood directly behind him, one hand gently yet ominously resting on his shoulder, as if to say, "Make the wrong move, and I will replace you." What sent chills through the ministers was not her ruthlessness, They were used to blood in the Tang court. What terrified them was how she used the very patriarchal system to dismantle itself. She did not draw swords in the royal courtyard. She did not start a rebellion. She used documents, ceremonies, and the exact strategies invented by the men who once dismissed her and turned those tools into weapons of quiet destruction. An example, when Emperor Gaozong fell ill, which was often as the man practically lived just to be sick. Minyang did not weep like some weepy empress from a romance drama. She drafted political passports. She sat in on trials. She made decisions. She ran the court. At first, it was under the title of advisor, then regent. And finally, she said it outright. Let us stop pretending. You are speaking to the true ruler. She did not just control the emperor. She controlled her own sons. The very children who were once her key to power now became expendable pawns. Li Hong, her eldest, was made crown prince. But then he developed a mind of his own. He dared to question her. He dared to challenge her policies. A fatal mistake. Before he could live a single day as emperor, Li Hong died suddenly, cause of death unclear. The court fell silent. All anyone knew was he had dared to oppose his mother. Then came Li Xian, her second son. He was named crown prince. And yes, you guessed it, he also dared to defy her. And so he was deposed, exiled, left to rot. A mother, yes, but more like a CEO, firing employees without notice. It was only with her third son, Li Dan, that the game changed. He knew when to stay quiet, when to nod, when to say mother is always right. That is how he kept his head. Some have asked, how could a mother treat her sons like chess pieces? But that is the wrong question. Minyang was never a mother in the lullaby-singing, cradle-rocking sense. She was a woman who offered her very womb to the game of power. Her sons were bridges. If a bridge shook, cut it down, build another. The imperial court began to react. A few elderly ministers, men who had once shared wine with the former emperor, who had once dismissed Wu Menyang as that girl in the corner, now erupted in fury. They accused her of interfering in state affairs, of violating moral order, of endangering the imperial body. They wrote petitions. They formed factions. They believed that if enough men stood together, the woman would retreat. And then, they started to disappear. No one died loudly. No one was publicly executed. They were simply reassigned to distant border posts and fell ill, accused of corruption and lost their posts, received anonymous letters with lists of crimes, and then drank poisoned wine in quiet suicides. Anyone else speak up? No, not one, because everyone understood this was a group lesson. By that point, Wu Menyang was no longer a regent or an empress. She was the power itself, and she began preparing to do what no one in Chinese history had ever dared to claim the throne for herself. Not as the wife of a king, not as the mother of a king, but as king. It sounded insane. But remember, this was a woman who had once been cast into a temple, forced into nunhood, thrown out by an entire system like yesterday's trash. And now she sat in the heart of the imperial palace reading documents that bore the title emperor instead of empress. She did not tear up the laws. She rewrote them, then had them printed on silk and stamped in gold. She even ran a full-blown political PR campaign. She commissioned statues of a female Buddha declaring herself the earthly incarnation of the Divine Mother. She had poems inscribed, praising her virtues, sent emissaries across the realm to spread the legend of the Mother of the Nation. It was a rebranding masterclass worthy of modern-day marketing. Had she lived today, she might have been the chief marketing officer for Meta or Netflix. The crowds began to change their tone. No one dared call her witch homewrecker or heretic nun anymore. They called her Heavenly Empress Mother of the Cosmos. A few sycophants even proposed starting an entirely new dynasty to replace the Tang and begin a new chapter in history under her name. And she agreed. In the year 690, Wu Mainyang officially declared herself emperor, becoming Wu Zetian, the first and only woman to rule as emperor in the entire history of China. Picture that moment, a woman dressed in the imperial dragon robe, seated on the dragon throne under the light of 100 palace lanterns, with hundreds of ministers bowing before her. No one dared to raise their head. No one dared to ask why. Because they all knew they were witnessing a bug in the feudal system. A bug with claws, with teeth, and a smile. When even the Buddha had to do her public relations. If power was a weapon, then Wu Zetian did not wield a sword, she wielded the Buddhist sutras. While the men were still waving blades and shouting about divine mandate, spinning tales of dragon-blooded lineage, she had already discovered a softer weapon, quieter yet sharper than any spear ever forged in Chinese history faith. No one taught her this. She learned it from life. She learned while reciting scriptures as a nun, not out of devotion, but because she had fallen from favor. She learned from the cold stares of monks who looked at concubines turned nuns like recycled trash. And from all of that, she drew one conclusion. If you cannot break the law, then make the sacred universe legalize you. At that time, the imperial court still leaned heavily toward Confucianism, a rigid ideology as dry as bureaucratic memos, saturated with rituals and patriarchy pounding women flat like rice cakes under a wooden mallet. But Buddhism was different. It was softer, broader, open to beauty, suffering, mysticism, and yes, even to women. And Wu Zetian understood that better than any monk ever could. She began pouring money into Buddhist temples, not for spiritual salvation, but for religious restructuring. She built massive temples, summoned monks from all corners, cast statues of the Buddha engraved scriptures in gold, and hosted sermons with the scale of a stadium concert. To outsiders, it looked like repentance. But in truth, she was marketing herself as the earthly incarnation of the Divine Mother, a female deity the world had never seen before. Scholars, historians, and even monks were shocked at first, but soon fell silent, because who would dare speak against the one who funded their temples, granted them land, and filled the treasury that paid for bronze bells? She did not need belief. She only needed the clergy to stay quiet and nod every time she appeared in a ritual. And when Buddhism gained the backing of the female emperor, it exploded like a startup fresh off a round of funding from a heavenly venture capitalist. Sermons began speaking of women achieving enlightenment of divine mandates beyond gender. One scripture, the Great Cloud Sutra, even declared that Wu Zetian was the earthly incarnation of Maitreya, the Buddha of the future, thus legally justifying her claim to the dragon throne. Impressive, is it not? No need to force anyone to acknowledge her power. Just invite the divine to bear witness. And it did not stop with temples. Wu Zetian redefined what it meant to be son of heaven entirely. She orchestrated new imperial rituals from the ground up. One striking example was the Fengshan ceremony on Mount Tai, the most sacred of all imperial rites, where only male emperors were traditionally allowed to offer sacrifices to heaven and earth, affirming their divine mandate. Wu Zetian not only demanded to participate, she demanded the spotlight. Imagine the scene if cameras had existed back then. Slow motion, of course, a woman clad in the imperial dragon robe standing at the center of heaven and earth's sacred energy, reading the ancestral invocation aloud before thousands, raising her gaze skyward as if to declare, "If heaven does not choose me, I choose myself." The old historians were furious. Their records hiss with passive-aggressive rage. They called her arrogant, ritually deviant, ungodly. But the people did not see it that way. They saw something much simpler, a woman who dared step onto a platform once reserved for men, and no one dared pull her down. From that moment on, the title Heavenly Empress was no longer a nickname. It became a brand. Wu Zetian was no longer a woman seizing power. She became a woman whose power was sanctioned by the heavens. And once you have divine endorsement, the bureaucrats below tend to fall in line. But her spiritual PR strategy did not stop there. She went a step further by rewriting the language itself. Yes, that is right. She invented entirely new Chinese characters specifically to write her own name. For example, the standard character Zhao Zhao was transformed into a new, more grandiose form. A rebranding of calligraphy so bold that even Apple's design team would bow in respect. Modern historians analyze these characters as symbols of absolute authority icons that forced the entire universe to reference her on her terms. And for the people of her time, when writing the emperor's name required special sacred characters, they understood this was no ordinary ruler. This was someone even the heavens had to acknowledge. People say she manipulated Buddhism, but look closer. She did not manipulate it, she updated it. She transformed it from an ascetic philosophy into a full-fledged ecosystem that legitimized female power. If Confucianism locked women inside the kitchen, then Wu Zetian's version of Buddhism placed women behind the pulpit. People today love to say she was cruel, she was ruthless. But if a male emperor had done exactly the same thing, would anyone have called it heresy? Or would they have said he was clever, strategic, a wise son of heaven? And that is the point. Wu Zetian's story was never about right or wrong. It was about a deeper question: who gets to rewrite the definitions of right and wrong? And while the world was busy arguing about morality, she had already finished the branding, finished the rituals, finished the spiritual PR campaign. Faith was not something she worshipped. Faith was the instrument she used to redesign power, and she wielded it without a tremor. In the next chapter, she will begin to build an entirely new dynasty, a dynasty that carried her own family name. But do not think that was her peak, because the higher you climb, the stronger the wind. And Wu Zetian was about to make her final move, not just to defend the throne, but to test whether the world would dare remember her name at all. Before we continue the story, where Wu Zetian establishes a new dynasty bearing her own surname, and redefines what it even means to be the son of heaven, if you have made it this far, welcome to the club. The club for people who love history, because it is bloodier than any crime novel. If you found this fascinating, bizarre, yet magnetic, or if you are simply sitting there wondering, why did no one tell us history like this in school, then go ahead and subscribe. Do not let the YouTube algorithm decide whether you get to hear the next part. And if there is a suspicious detail you noticed, or a historical conspiracy theory you want to unravel together, leave a comment below. This channel is not just about storytelling. This is where history comes alive and claps back at the world. The death list and a no-mercy governing strategy. Once you have rewritten the rules, renamed the dynasty, and built temples that market yourself as a living Buddha, the question is no longer who supports her, but rather who dares to oppose her. And for Wu Zetian, that list was not very long, but it did get shorter. Quite literally. This was the era when the Zhou dynasty, the one she established after seizing power from the Tang royal bloodline, began to function like a lethal startup. Every imperial court meeting was a round of survivor, and anyone who spoke the wrong word or breathed the wrong way could be permanently voted off the island. Wu Zetian did not need swords to rule. She used something far more terrifying process, a machine of accusations, investigations, and punishments, all wrapped in a shell of righteous justice, but inside, it was a long-prepared purge list, written by her hand in iron ink and blood. At the top of that list, Zhang Sun Wuji, a veteran statesman of the Tang court, once the right-hand man of a former emperor, and one of the last old uncles brave enough to look Wu Zetian in the eye and say, "No, fatal mistake." He was accused of treason, stripped of all positions, exiled, and left to die in isolation. It all happened in silence, as if history itself had hit the backspace key on his name. Next was Han Yuan, a famously upright official who once dared to advise Wu Zetian to keep personal feelings out of state affairs. The result, an anonymous letter of denunciation, emerged accusing him of bribery and conspiracy. No public trial. He was arrested, tortured, and never returned to court. Rumor has it he died in prison clutching a Confucian classic in his hand, as if morality would protect him from the truth that she did not need morality to govern. Even within her own family, Wu Zetian showed no mercy. Crown Prince Li Zhong, her eldest son with Emperor Gaozong, was once chosen as heir to the throne. But he made one fatal mistake. He dared to oppose his mother's claim to the throne. He dared in front of the entire court to say, "My mother should remain Empress Dowager. She should not replace my father as the ruler of the nation." And just like that, he was deposed. Then came exile, a slow fade into darkness. No one dared speak his name again. Historical records mention an accusation that Li Zhong wielded weapons and plotted rebellion. A convenient excuse, an old excuse, but still just enough to make someone disappear. All these eliminations had one thing in common: no public executions. There were no severed heads in the town square like some martial arts movie. Wu Zetian mastered the art of silent death, the kind that switches off like a light. No one could say exactly when it happened. Only that when you next opened your eyes, they were no longer there. She did not need to shout. She only had to signal. A glance, a letter, a temporary reassignment, an order without a seal, but with the unmistakable sound of hearts pounding the moment her name appeared beside theirs. You think that is terrifying? That was just the administrative protocol. The true horror was how she embedded a network of eyes, ears, and loyalty built not on trust, but on fear. Picture a morning in the Zhou court. Ministers bow low, the rain tapping softly outside. Wu Zetian sits on the throne, silent, but the officials, they say nothing. No one knows who will be next, because the next person is always the one you least expect. So they begin to report each other preemptively. One official accuses another in a formal petition. Palace maids report other palace maids. Eunuchs report ministers. Ministers report ministers. The entire court becomes a survival game of blow the whistle first or be eliminated. And above this bloody chessboard, Wu Zetian remains still, like a cold-blooded AI system silently collecting data before issuing the next silent command. But do not mistake this for inhuman cruelty. To her, this was survival logic. She was a woman who had once been cast into a temple, branded a whore, and plotted against by an entire political machine. She could not hold the throne with sentiment. She needed results and zero risk. And there was no greater risk than those who once believed she did not deserve to be emperor. And yet among those who were purged, not all were villains. Some were loyal, some were brilliant. Some had once helped her when she had nothing. But by the time she stood at the very summit of power, Wu Zetian understood one hard truth. Those who once helped her had also once seen her weak. And that could not be allowed to survive. The question is, was Wu Zetian lonely? Yes, profoundly. Her loneliness ran so deep she began to cultivate loyalty through affection. Rather than relying on trusted ministers, she surrounded herself with favored companions, young men who were handsome, healthy, skilled in music, quick with flattery, expert in massage, and above all, unconditionally loyal. They knew nothing of politics, had no factions. They had only her, and for her that was enough. Historians call them male favorites, names like Zhang Changzong and Zhang Yiji, who entered her life like pampered pets with GPS collars. But in truth, they were her final shield. A thin layer of intimacy standing between her and a patriarchal world that would never forgive the woman who once trampled it beneath her feet. An old woman wielding absolute power, ruling over a dynasty of her own making, yet trusting no one, leaning on no one, forgiving no one who had ever doubted her. That was Wu Zetian in her twilight years. She no longer resembled a person. She had become a corrupted, emotional operating system for power. And anyone who dared hit the reset button would be deleted from history's hard drive. So do not be surprised if in the next chapter, she begins rebranding her legacy through poetry, literature, painting, and calligraphy like an ancient influencer. Because once you have eliminated nearly everyone who could challenge your reign, the only thing left to control is how you will be remembered. And Wu Zetian did not wait for history to write about her. She wrote history and signed her name. When history did not describe her, but defamed her, when you are the only woman in Chinese history to have ever sat on the imperial throne, the first question historians ask is not, what did she accomplish? But rather, was she even worth remembering? And that word worth, unfortunately, was not measured in merit. It was measured in gender. Wu Zetian did not die in war. She did not die in rebellion. She did not die from some sudden illness. She died of old age, nearly 82, outliving most of her enemies, outlasting every conspiracy, outmaneuvering nearly every soul who had once opposed her. When she passed, the world did not fall. Her Zhou dynasty quietly dissolved, her son Li Xian was restored to the Tang throne, and the entire political machine resumed as if a female emperor had never existed. That was when the real game began, the game of rewriting memory. No one could deny the power Wu Zetian once held. But they did not have to. They only had to redefine her. And so began one of the most elaborate smear campaigns in East Asian history. A revenge not of blades, but of language. Every sentence was dipped in acid. The old book of Tang described her as cruel, immoral, lustful, suspicious. The new book of Tang added more inhumane, tyrannical, obsessed with sex and wine, violator of heaven's mandate. Not a word about her being decisive, intelligent, or strategic, words so often used for male emperors who slaughtered their families to claim the throne. But for her, merely a demon in the form of a woman. And if you think those accounts were just personal opinions, think again. These were the official textbooks of the Tang court, compiled by the very dynasty she had once dethroned. Imagine divorcing your husband, and 30 years later, his son writes your biography. That is Chinese history's version of Wu Zetian. Some historical records did not even call her emperor. Instead, they used Empress Wu or Empress Dowager, as if despite the fact that she seized the throne, they could drag her back into the gendered cage through sheer grammatical force. She was the ruler, yet history forced her to wear the title of mother. She held the throne, yet was dressed in metaphorical skirts on every page. Later, Confucian scholars took their resentment to epic heights. They wrote satirical essays, mocking poems, painted her wrapped in young men, guzzling wine in ecstasy, as if her existence was not about ruling an empire, but proving that women in power must inevitably descend into madness. And if they had never met her, no problem. They had imagination and a deep dynastic loathing for anything that smelled like feminism. Even her tomb carries a deliberate silence. Where other emperors had epitaphs carved in ornate detail achievements, victory's words of praise, Wu Zetian's gravestone is nothing but a blank slab. No inscription, no engraving, no tribute. As if the world were whispering she existed. But we refuse to acknowledge her. But wait, that is not a failure. That is a strange kind of victory. Because you know what? No one gets a blank tombstone unless they are too terrifying to describe. That silence is the final admission from a patriarchal society we could not defeat her. So we will pretend she never happened. And in that moment, history stops being a record. It becomes collective manipulation. They did not erase her from the history books they kept her, but rewrote her as a warning, not as praise, not as inspiration, but as a morality tale. A message, do not be like her. She is what happens when a woman goes too far. A backhanded lesson aimed directly at every little girl reading those pages. The result. For centuries afterward, folklore twisted her into something monstrous. Stories spread of Wu Zetian eating children, drugging wine, seducing young men to death, casting dark spells, chasing immortality through alchemy. It reads like ancient horror fiction. And yet none of these accusations appeared in records from her lifetime. They bloomed only after she died. Because when society can no longer control a woman's power, they try to bury her beneath every crime they can imagine, to make sure no one ever dares follow. And that is what makes the story of Wu Zetian so paradoxical and so magnificent. You can love her or hate her. You can see her as cruel or as someone simply trying to survive. But one thing you cannot do is deny that she existed, and her existence, despite the smears, the edits, the distortions, has lasted longer than those who rewrote her story. Because even if the chronicles called her a demon, the future still remembers her name. Even if no one dared carve her achievements into stone, she remains the only woman who ever made an entire empire bow. Even if they tried to paint her as a monster, the very effort made people curious about the truth behind the mockery. And that truth, whether confirmed or not, continues to smolder in the minds of those who have asked the quiet question. If she were a man, would anyone have called her a monster? And if she was a monster, then perhaps history has grown too dull with saints. Maybe it is time we made space for a villain who knew how to take the throne and dared to sign her name in blood. The final twist. Wu Zetian was not a feminist icon. She was the system's nightmare. If you have made it through this journey from part 1 until now, you have likely felt every emotion possible for Wu Zetian: awe, shock, admiration, discomfort, outrage, and relentless curiosity. But this final part is not some warm, celebratory ending where she is honored in the history books with glowing praise. No. This is the twist, the kind that ends a film with a cold stare into the camera and a question that makes you drop your glass. Because the truth is, Wu Zetian was not a feminist icon. She did not represent all women. She did not fight for equality. She did not emerge from any grand movement for female liberation. She was quite simply power, uncolored, ungendered, unlimited. And that is precisely what made her a nightmare not for men, but for the system. The system that for 1,000 years had defined the rules women submit. Men decide, women bear children, men rule kingdoms, women learn embroidery, men study warfare. That system did not fear delicate concubines or elegant dancers. It was terrified of one thing: a woman who could govern a nation, navigate statecraft, manage an empire, and order executions without blinking. Wu Zetian's very existence was like a glitch in the ancient operating system, a bug that was never meant to be, but once it appeared, no one dared hit delete. The imperial establishment tried to patch the code rewrite, the annals distort the narrative, seal the memory. But her name, Wu Zetian, remained standing boldly across thousands of pages. Unerasable, unignorable, unforgivable, because it exposed the flaw in what was supposed to be an eternal order. And that is what turned her from a ruler into a political phenomenon, a signal flare, a question etched into history. If this happens again, what will we do? Think that is the end. There is one final twist, one last pivot you never saw coming. Wu Zetian, in her final years, when her power had faded, when the very people who once pledged loyalty had betrayed her, when she was forced to abdicate and locked away in the palace, left behind no protest, no declaration, no tragic farewell letter, no tearful repentance, just silence, a silence with the weight of 10,000 soldiers. You could call it a failure, but you would be wrong. Because if a woman who started as a nameless palace girl was cast into a temple, returned to manipulate an emperor, dethrone an empress, execute her own son, establish a dynasty force, Buddhism to kneel and rule an empire like a supercomputer, managing the universe, died peacefully in her bed, then please tell me, where exactly is the failure? And if she truly failed, why are millions of people still reading about her today? Still haunted by the questions, was she truly as evil as the records claim? Did she have any other choice? If she were a man, would we judge her differently? Those questions alone prove that her legacy outlived politics. She crossed into the sacred realm of culture where questions matter more than answers. Someone once said, if Wu Zetian was the first woman to become emperor, she was also the last. And they were right. For thousands of years, after her, not a single woman ever touched the imperial throne of China again. No one dared. No one was allowed. Because the system had learned its lesson. And that lesson was written in blood, in fire, in the unblinking stare of a woman who once ruled an empire without asking anyone's permission. History did not love her. Historians did not forgive her. Society did not teach its daughters to follow her. But she never needed their approval. She did not write the book. She was the book. Every action was a paragraph. Every decision a punctuation mark. Every purge an italicized line. And the name Wu Zetian, no matter how many tried to erase it, remained fixed, unmoving, as the name of someone who once stood above them all and never apologized. Because in the end, she was not born to be a symbol. She was born to prove one thing: if you are not allowed to become power, then become the thing that power fears. Thank you for joining us on this journey, one that lasted longer than Wu Zetian's manipulation of the Tang Dynasty. And if you have made it this far, it means you do not just love history. You have the spirit to uncover the truths that were buried, twisted, and forbidden. If you found this story thought-provoking, terrifying, or just straight up, what the hell, then do not forget to hit that subscribe button. Because every subscription is not just a show of support, it is a pat on the back for the team to keep digging up history's darkest, wildest secrets. Was she admirable or terrifying? Leave a comment and let us know what you think, so the algorithm knows you are not afraid of the truth. We will see you in the next insane story. And trust me, history is not out of surprises yet.